she, and me and her and me, and stuff happens. We do have discussions, we say things, and I'm always trying to say the right thing. I'm trying to be funny, but obviously I'm never funny. So I'm trying to be funny, but at the same time, it's complex. If I succeed in convincing the person I'm worth knowing, I've been the master and she's been the servant. In Hegel's romantic description of how these two self-consciousnesses interact, right? But that doesn't stop. It's not over. In fact, the beauty of his description of the master-servant is that the master ends up becoming so dependent on the servant that the servant actually becomes the master. So it's considered great literature because it's ironic, right? The one that thinks that the master is actually the servant, and it actually keeps changing, right, as it goes. Well, that's one possibility where you've got two persons with two different self-consciousnesses engaged in this dialectic. But as I mentioned, it could also be the whole class and me and my consciousness, right? Each of you are actually, of course, framing your own self-conscious. Think of the complexity involved just here in this classroom. And it evolves into still a bigger picture when you think about anchorage. Does anchorage have a self-consciousness? Yes, it does. As a member of this community, we all think of anchorage as having certain characteristics. Are we all in agreement over them? Certainly not. But when we go and hang out together at the assembly, where everyone gets up and says their piece, and everybody's sitting there going, who let this idiot in here? See how that goes, right? We end up forming a consciousness that we think of as anchorage. And we have laws, we make agreements and so on. So there's a dialectical process that creates the level of self-consciousness associated with, say, the assembly and the law of anchorage, right? Is the mayor part of this? The Mayor LaFrance, Susan LaFrance. The last time I saw her, everyone was complimenting her on keeping the streets plowed this year. And everybody laughs because, actually it was nothing that she did. It was the stupid weather, right? Didn't give us enough snow to cause it a problem, right? Alaska. Does Alaska have a self-consciousness? It sure does. We have a government that's supposed to represent us. We get involved in arguing with one another over what Alaska should be or how it should treat its citizens or treat nature or oil or, so it's a constant dialectical process between all of the elements that are part of it. And of course, the United States has such a thing. We think of the elections. So many people say, oh, we've destroyed democracy. Look what we've done. Other folks say, I don't think that word means what you think it means. Because that was democracy that did that. The democracy is as strong as ever. More people are participating in it than have ever participated. Because, of course, we've got social communications now that enable more people to be aware of what's going on and get excited and participate, form their views, argue with other individuals within their group or outside their group. If you think of all of this as in the framework of the phenomena of consciousness and self-consciousness, you can see that this interpretation that Hegel's giving us in this one section of the phenomenology can be explored in all of these different ways. In fact, you can go all the way up to the Weltgeist. You've heard that expression, the Weltgeist? The world soul or the world spirit, right? Is there a world consciousness? Do we have a consciousness that we can think of as the world's consciousness? And in a manner of speaking, of course there is. It's even more complex, of course. But we think of what each of us think, what's the world? You know, what's important to the world? How can we engage one another in making the world, you know, survive for our children, you know, and for the 10th generation ahead, or I forget what Chief Seattle said, 10 generations, whatever, you know, you have to think, you know, way ahead, you know. Plastics, you know, is that really good? You know, it eventually gets to the point where children are 90% plastic. I don't know if that's possible. And who is God? God is obviously a Geist also. Not just the Der Heilige Geist, the Holy Ghost, but the absolute Geist. The greatest, right? That than which nothing greater can be thought. It's also phenomena. That's also spirit. So Kant says you can't really know God, even though God must be there. Hegel says, the Bible says knowing God and having faith in God is the greatest call for every soul. So how can you conclude, like Kant, that we can't know God? Of course we know God. It's the Weltgeist, probably, maybe, or the absolute Geist. So who is God, you know, for, but is God self-aware? Does God have a master-slave dialectic? Our stories say that. If we go back to Augustine, remember he puts God in the middle, and it looks to us like we're interacting with God, so that seems like God is constantly changing, but God can't be changing. So, yeah, so in some sense, God is infinite and aware of everything. Is there a master-slave? That's the impression that each of us have. I still can't get over that the government in the Philippines, wasn't it, that arrested the woman that said Jesus ought to have a haircut? Because she might cause all kinds of problems in their culture. I don't know. But yeah, master-slave. So we end up with a true self-consciousness. Once you come to realize, of course, that is my self-consciousness. What's one of the advantages of following Hegel and having a course like this is coming to realize that this process does describe perhaps the best we know of who I am. That I'm engaged in this kind of a self-dialectic with myself constantly. The alarm goes off. Do I really have to get up? Constant, right? But if I want to be the best, I've got to get up, put on some sort of clothing, arrive, and do the stuff I'm supposed to do. And is the world self-conscious? A lot of people think it's ridiculous. Obviously, the world's not self-aware. Well, but wait a minute. You are part of the world. Are you self-aware? Yes. So the world is self-aware, because part of it, at least, is self-aware. So guess what? At least through your self-consciousness, the world is aware of itself. And this is Hegel, right? Consciousness, right? So consciousness is not an isolated, immediate fact, but a historical and historical. It's evolving. When we study humanity, what we discover is that history is a process of this gradual, evolving dialectic of self-consciousness. For Hegel, the different periods, for example, are the gradual evolving of more and more freedom. And by the way, he predicts that the United States will be the place where freedom will evolve the next stage, right? This is back, 1820, 1828. somewhere around there, he says this. So you can see, wow, that's clearly something that was quite amazing for him to predict at that time. And what is freedom? You think of freedom as, if you are a self-conscious, self-aware individual, you're arguing with yourself all the time over what you should do, and obviously you're making choices somehow in how you end up, right? So you're clearly free. In fact, even if you're in jail, even if you're strapped to a chair, your consciousness is still continuing its dialectical process. Should I act more reasonable? Will they let me out of the chair if I behave myself? If they come and give me a pill, I don't know why, but I'm picturing Taylor Swift sitting in a room upside down, and the nurse comes in and puts a pill on her tongue, and she swallows it, and then they let her leave, and she goes now in a black dress to a room where she's going to sit there and type. You seen that video? Whatever, right? Obviously, she decided to let them drug her so that she could be considered sane, so she could go to work and type. By the way, that video sold more of those Olivetti typewriters, or whatever those old typewriters were. Everybody wanted one because of that video. Freedom, I think today, in physics, is called entropy. Entropy? What is entropy? It's kind of like the universe is expanding. As it expands and all the particles move away from one another, that's freedom, but it's also destruction. Entropy is when, the system that's ordered all of a sudden collapses because the forces that keep it together have deteriorated, and you have more freedom. And in studying this, I was really influenced by Carl Sagan's son. I might have misspelled cool. There it is. Into the cool. So what's happening in the universe? The universe is, this is a law, the law of the second law of thermodynamics, that all systems gradually deteriorate. Too brief? That approximately right? So everything breaks eventually. Everything falls apart. But humans are doing a great job. Look at animals. And by the way, notice how this whole view of evolution has also impacted biology through Erasmus Darwin and then Charles Darwin and his other, there are a lot of contemporaries. Wallace and others are all trying to do this. It gradually impacts, if you think about self-consciousness and how this dialectical process, a lot of people are resistant. They don't want to move into this new story. But the ones that are involved in the new story, they believe it's absolutely true. So they're constantly trying to persuade those that won't believe it to believe it. So you get this dialectical process, right? It's the same thing as me convincing myself I really ought to put more money in an IRA this year or something. Oh, actually I can't because I'm too old. But you get the idea. I have to take out now. I thought, wow, I have all these IRAs, and I have to take a required minimum D, whatever the D stands for. And you think, oh, I've got this big IRA, and then you figure out, well, IRS thinks I have 16.4 years left to live. So you divide your amounts up by 16.4, and the required minimum that you take is that, which actually turns out to be like $700 for the year. So if you're planning on retiring off of these IRAs, remember that if you divide it up, you're only going to get like enough for a TV for the year. Actually, TVs are quite a lot cheaper now, but you get the idea. That's silly. But so you get everything is collapsing, but human beings and other animals are doing an amazing job of keeping their organization together. Look at the complexity involved in keeping a human being. I mean, I've seen it. Women get infected with one of these things. You know me, I don't really have a clue how this happens. But they end up swelling up. I've seen it. They get really big. And then all of a sudden one day, they're carrying it around. And we call it a child. You look at it, and it's actually kind of neat because tomorrow is Friday, the birthday of my oldest daughter. She will be 43. And I remember I was at work in Berlin, and my wife called me. We were on days, the day shift. And whoa, nobody calls during the day shift. That's the busiest time. But she called. So I answered the phone. They came and said, Sergeant Jamison, your wife is on the phone. What? You're kidding. I answered the phone. She says, the hospital just called and says we need a name for our daughter. Keep in mind, my wife was not pregnant. So this is like a surprise. Well, we had actually previously discussed it, and daughters, the first one gets the name Catherine Emma Jamison. So, okay, yeah, we're good with that. But it also meant we have to pick up our daughter tomorrow. So I went to the NCOIC and I said, I need some time off tomorrow morning, because the hospital just called and I have to pick up my daughter. And he looked at me and he says, I don't think you're going to be worth shit tomorrow. And I said, I don't think I'm going to be worth shit today. And that morning we went into the hospital and there she is. We're taking this home. They made us take it. That's neat. You're laughing at that because I'm stealing that humor from Bill Cosby, but I can't tell you that because Bill Cosby is illegal now. But they made us take it home. And they gave us a British nurse to come and visit each day to make sure that it was still growing, because it was only 4 pounds something. I remember the first look on its face when I came in and I said, hello. And she looked up at me and her face said, who the hell are you?